All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to go ahead and fly through chapter 4. The reason why I say fly through it is because it's really just a general overlook of a lot of the stuff that we're going to be doing in macroeconomics. And then we're going to dive into chapter 5, where we start to get into some of the more nitty-gritty definitions and some of those lovely math problems that I know we're all waiting for. So we're really just going to discuss, like I said, the broad issues, the types of data. We're going to talk about the three major types of economic policy. We're going to talk once again about that difference between positive and normative analysis. And lastly, we're going to talk a bit about the difference, what's micro versus macro. And then in the same vein, what is this thing called aggregation? What are its merits? What are the problems with it? So like I said, that should take up the first 30 minutes of class, and then we'll move on to chapter 5, talk about GDP, and call it a day. All right, so an introduction, just a historical introduction for us, right? Macroeconomics was really born of the Great Depression. At least the macroeconomics that we know today. So the Great Depression, right, was, initially blamed on the 1929 stock market panic. But, when we really look back on that, there were other stock market drops that were just as bad, and the Great Depression was a global phenomenon, right? And so the broad consensus among economists and policymakers is that, the reason why, the cause of the Great Depression was inadequate macroeconomic policy and really kind of just awareness. So the Great Depression was pretty gnarly, right? Some highlights are, factories cut production by 31%. So nearly a third of all factory output was just shut down. We had unemployment rise rose by 3 times, so more than tripled, to 25% in 1933. And like I said, there was that stock market panic, right? And so another indicator that we look at is the fact that, globally stocks, oh wait, sorry, this is just in the US, but stocks lost a third of their value in 3 weeks. Very, very substantial amount of wealth lost there. But again, this wasn't just, so this is all in the US. In Germany, they had a third of their workers without jobs. And they had a complete collapse of their banking system. Which just made things worse, right? Everybody going to the bank and withdrawing their money, and then at a certain point, there's not enough money, and so then people are mad, and the banks have to shut down. But that just, what does that do? That decreases the amount of loans that are being produced, right? So again, it wasn't the stock market. It wasn't, just this one in particular wasn't just the natural booms and busts of capitalism, right? But it was actually these government actions designed to the lack of government actions and the lack of government awareness, really, of what was going on and how to fix it. So how did they fix it? Well, they initiated some of the first macroeconomic policies in the history of our civilization. So these are government actions designed to affect the performance of the economy as a whole. And it's that as a whole part that really makes the difference between this and previous government programs, and then also the difference between micro and macroeconomics. So what are these major macroeconomic issues, right, that the government is keeping an eye on and is trying to help us with? So the first one is what we call our standard of living. Now we here in the U.S., we're spoiled. We, expect this standard of living to, stay the same and actually grow over time, right? And so what is this standard of living? This is, the degree to which that people have access and can afford, that's also part of it here, right? Access and can afford goods and services that make their lives easier, healthier, safer, and more enjoyable. The second one is economic growth. Economic growth, again, it's not that we expect the standard of living to stay exactly the same. We expect it to grow over time, right? So economic growth is talking about a process of steady increases in both the quantity and quality of the goods and services that the economy can provide. So economic output in the United States has grown historically by quite a lot. If we look at chart here where we start off in 1929, middle is 1969, 1999, and 2019. And if we have output over here, and if this is all in 2009 dollars, and it's in billions. So we've already taken care of the fact that things used to cost way less in the past, right? So this is all assuming that everything is the same price, right? Our initial output when we started taking this data was around 1,000, which is, what would that be? That would be 1 trillion, because 1,000 billion is a trillion, right? So it's about $1 trillion. Now again, you know, we had that Great Recession, so we kind of, you know, stuck around at that level until a lot of government programs started to ramp up. We also had war spending ramping up going into the 1949, you know, the start of the war, us selling all of that armaments and things like that abroad. Then that decreased, so we're around 2,000 here, or 2 trillion. And then since then, we have seen a steady growth to the point where, you know, we hit about 4 trillion by that 1969. So I actually need to go, I need to move this over. Because we end up hitting 4 trillion in 1969, around there. And then, you know, 6 trillion in 1979, to the point where, you know, we're getting up to 14, 16 trillion in the most recent situation, right? So 14 trillion, 16 trillion. Now what's this going on right here? That is the 2008 financial crisis, which created the quote-unquote Great Recession. So, you know, just some kind of, you know, facts from here, right? In 2001, the U.S. economy was 15 times bigger than the 1929 level. And 4 times bigger than the 1964 level. So really, we've experienced quite an increase in the total amount of output. So that's the other thing too we need to focus on here, is this is the total amount of output. So again, I'm stressing that total amount of output because if we wanted to look instead at the output per worker, which is really a better representation of the standard of living, right? Then what would we have? Hey, could you put your mask on back in the back there? Second to last row. Got earbuds in. I don't even know why you're here. Yeah. Could you either put your mask on, take your earbuds out and leave, or yeah, cool. You don't need to be here. Just point that out. Literally can't hear what I'm saying. That's a new one. 1929. So when we're looking at the output per worker, again, we're going to do that same type of thing. We've already adjusted for the fact that prices have risen over time because we're using all 2009 dollars. So that's not an issue here. And again, we're talking about output per worker. And then this is all going to be in thousands, but I'm going to write the thousands. So we started off in 1929 with some output per worker that was around $20,000. And again, this is already accounting for the price changes. So what we see over time is we see, and again, we didn't see too much increase until we got into that wartime spending and the public programs, and then we saw a gradual rise of the output per worker to the point where it's now around, 100K. Now, this is one standard of living, right? This is talking about if we took all the output and we divided it by all the workers. But that's actually not what's happening, right? There's taxes, there's government programs, there's a lot of money that's going to people that are not workers. So another metric that we can use is we can look at the output per person. So this is just per all of the people that live in the United States. And we find that this has really only gone, close to 40, 50,000. So while the productivity of our workers has increased tremendously, right? So, $100,000 per worker, the actual output per worker, while it's the output per person is not growing as fast and has only risen to, about 40, 50,000. But what we have found in terms of this output per worker is that, is that it's about 5 times. So in 2014, the output per worker, Y over N. So these are abbreviations we're going to need to learn. Y is output. N is the the workers in this point. That was 5 times than the 1929 level. So this is a good thing, right? This means that, per person working, the same amount of hours, right? We pretty much had this 40-hour work week during this whole time, right? That we have a lot more produced because of that worker. And we'll talk a lot about that in future chapters. So again, this is just a preview of the issues and the things that we're monitoring as newly appointed macroeconomic scientists. So, some other kind of, untraditional metrics that we see a lot have to do with, access to certain, staple goods, right? So for every 100 people in the US, 90 of them are cellular subscribers. So I don't even know if that's not talking about all the prepaid phones, right? We know that, the latest data, and I know this is probably crazy for a lot of us to think about, is 84, well, actually, I don't know, because maybe some of you don't really, like I know some people that just use their smartphones for literally everything, so even if they have a computer, they don't use it, right? So 84 of households own a computer. A lot of that has to do with our large elderly population, right? But again, this is a good metric, right? We've got so many people that have a computer, and then 74% of households use the internet, right? They have access and use of the internet. So these are other ways for us to talk about how well the country is doing, right? If these are increasing over time, then that means that the country is doing better macroeconomically. Similar things, right? We can talk about 90% of the adult population has a high school diploma. So counting out GEDs there. And then the reason why we're here, right, 34% of the adult pop in the United States has a college degree. So again, when we're talking about productivity, productivity is not as tricky as you think it would be. It's literally just the total output. Let's spell total right. Divided by the number of people employed. That's going to give us our average labor productivity. Questions on that? Questions on anything up until this part? So part of why we do this is so that we have some internal metrics, right? We can kind of compare against what has happened in the past. And we can compare against maybe our forecasts. We were supposed to have this much productivity improvement, but there hasn't been a lot of productivity improvement, and that we can look into that and try to craft policies so that we could improve those metrics, right? The other part of it is that we can actually look and compare ourselves to other countries, right? So there's a lot of talk about China, right? About how China has, they're coming up and they're going to be one of the largest producers in the world, right? But when we look at data, and this is a little bit dated, I'll give you that, but it hasn't changed too much since then. So if you look at data between the United States and between China, we start to see the difference in productivity and living standards emerge very quickly, right? So when we look at output, just that total GDP, that how much have you produced, that's going to be $18 trillion in the United States compared to $11 trillion in China. And again, this is converting for exchange rates, so on and so forth, right? And then we have population. In the United States, we've got 321 million people. In China, they have 1.371 billion people. So 4 to 5 times more people than us. What about the employment? Well, in China, in the United States, 148 million of those 321 million are full-time employed. In China, that number goes up to 765 million of their 1.3 billion. When we do the math, we find that the output per person for the United States is $56,000 compared to $8,000. And then the other thing we would want to look at, right, is the output per worker, or what? The average labor productivity. In the United States, we find that that is, in 2014, $121,000. In China, it's $14,000. So part of why we keep these metrics, why we pay attention to these metrics, why we, have to learn the definition of them, is so that we can have a good grip in terms of, what's going on internationally. We can compare with other countries and take a look. Because if we just look at the output, you know, it shows a very different message than by looking at, you know, the output per person and the average labor productivity. So these are important things to keep in mind. So, got to talk a little bit about unemployment rates. And again, you know, we're going to get into this in greater detail in the future. This is just a primer, right? And so, you know, if we look at this unemployment rate over time, once again, we didn't start taking any of this data until 1929. We find that, you know, if this is 5%, this is 10%, we find that the unemployment rate, you know, just went like crazy off the charts and then started to kind of get back to normal, sank to some low rates, stuck around 5% for a while, got a little bit higher in the 70s, then did its like cyclical thing. And, you know, we've been chilling around this 5% unemployment rate for a while now. So what does this mean? This means that 5% of the people that are actively looking for a job and that are not students, that are not kids, that are not retired, right? So they're actively looking for a job, can't find one. So some general observations about the unemployment rate. It always rises during recessions, right? Recessions are a period of economic downturns like the Great Recession that happened in 2008. And then the other thing about the unemployment rate is it is always, always, always greater than zero. And it's never zero. There's a certain amount of unemployment, and again, we'll talk about this in greater detail. There's a certain amount of unemployment that's to be expected, and you know, can be argued is healthy for a capitalist economy. Now, again, this unemployment, you know, it differs from country to country. So, you know, for the last 20 years, Europe has had more than 10% of their workforce unemployed. So unemployment rate in Europe, you know, was over 10%, which is double that of the United States. And this was not always the case. You know, if we looked back to the 1950s and 60s, the European unemployment rate was always lower than the US. So part of this, and again, we'll talk about this in the future, part of this has to do with the fact that there's a lot of labor protections in European markets, you know, and so they're very, very hesitant to hire somebody because it's almost like marrying that person. Like you can't do, like, firing the person is like a legal divorce where you have to like talk about why and talk about how you tried to work through it and you know, all this other kind of stuff. So as a result, there's a lot of costs. Because of the costs of getting rid of an employee, there's a lot of hesitancy to hire employees, and so there's a lot of labor market frictions in Europe that a lot of economists say is partly the cause of this persistent high unemployment rate. So the last kind of boring thing we're going to talk about, hopefully today, is the inflation rate. So the inflation rate, this is something that can dip negative, right? So when we model this over time, it's going to look a little bit different than before because it can actually turn negative. So what is inflation? Inflation is the rate that prices in general increase over time. That the prices of goods and services increase. Now we, see very mild inflation, right? I mean, we might see inflation in, gasoline or something like that, right? But for the most part, a lot of the products that we purchase haven't increased that much, right? It's low in the 90s and today. But it was very high in the 1970s. And obviously, like everything else, it varies by country, from country to country. So from 1929 to 2019, again, let's have some breakout points here. 1939, 1969, 1989. So inflation, we start off at zero because we had no data before this, so that's just like a failure of the way that we model data. It wasn't that we had zero inflation in 1929. So we start off and there's negative inflation to the tune of, like this is -5, this is -10. So we're going all the way down to -10. So prices are dropping on an average of 10% every year, which is not good because what happens when prices drop, that means that the wage that you get, because you're part of the process of making that good, the wage that you get drops or you get fired. Because if prices are dropping, companies not making as much money, they can't afford to pay you. And so this kind of negative rate of change in the prices is very bad. So we experienced this during the Great Depression, right? We kind of climbed ourselves out of it through government spending, through, selling a lot of arms internationally, and then through involving ourselves in the war and a lot of deficit spending. And then we ended up having, that nice kind of post-war, pleasant period where we had some inflation, right? This is about 5%. So you want something between, this is your Goldilocks range, between the 0 and 5%. You don't want anything too high is bad, and anything too low is, anything below 0 is worse. So anything high is really bad, but anything low is worse. So these periods right here, it got near to 15%, which is really not the best situation there. This was in the prime of our war spending here. This is 1949. And then we had a period of pretty low inflation, and then partly because of international oil prices and cartels and the fact that we became so dependent on oil and we had no production of U.S. oil at this point, we had a lot of inflation that happened in the 70s, again, getting back to that 15% level. And then since then, we've really had a long period where, the central bank and the other financial, the treasury and stuff like that, have done a pretty good job of keeping it, like I said, within that band of, around 0 to 5%. So this has been a period of very modest inflation, which is good. That's what we want. So as we can see, it varies over time, and it also varies by country. So, in 2001, the inflation rate in the United States was 3%. In 2001, the inflation rate in the Ukraine was 400%. Same year, very, very different set of circumstances. One of the other trends that we find is that there's an increasing interdependence between national economies. So some proof of this, well, in 2016, the U.S. exported 12% of all the goods and services produced. About 15% of that is usually armaments, right? We're the world's largest gun exporter. And we imported, same year, 2016, we imported 15% of all the goods and services that Americans used. U.S. households purchased. So when you guys hear about, these hot button phrases about, a trade deficit is not always bad. Trade deficit is literally just when your exports that year are less than your imports. So we were in a trade deficit in 2016, right? A trade surplus is just the opposite, right? When your exports are greater than your imports. So what does the federal government do? So these are all the different issues that we talked about. What are the three things that the government does? Well, the first thing that it does is it has monetary policy. So the first thing in its toolkit is something called monetary policy. And so this is determining how large or small the money supply is. So it's determination of the national money supply. So this is controlled by the Central Bank of the United States, which is not a government entity, but it does respond to Congress, and it's congressionally mandated and reports to Congress. So it's controlled by the Federal Reserve System, also just known as the Fed. And the Fed is the U.S. Central Bank. I think it's the third U.S. Central Bank that we've ever had. My memory is correct. And so a central bank is a lender of last resort. So it has the power to inject more money in the economy. And they're a lender of last resort during panics. So, if the bank goes bankrupt and they need to borrow some money, who are they going to go to? They go to the Federal Reserve, the central bank. So the other thing that we have at our disposal is something called fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, we all just, enjoyed some fiscal policy a couple times this last year, right? With the government stimulus money. So this is, the decisions that determine the government's budget. And so what does that mean? That means, essentially the revenue side of it, how much and who gets taxed. And then the expenditure side, right? Where do we spend the money? Who gets the money? And in what volume? So this answers the question of how much should the government spend and on what? So once again, just like we had trade deficits and trade surpluses, fiscal policy is going to end up, if your revenues are less than your expenses, then you're going to be running a government deficit. If your revenues are greater than your expenses, you are running a government surplus. So who knows whether or not we currently are running a government deficit? Yes or no? Show of hands. Show of hands for yes. Show of hands for no. So we absolutely are. We're running a huge government deficit. We've been running a huge government deficit for a while now. COVID made it worse, obviously, partly because of the programs, but also just partly because of the lack of tax receipts. Part of also the reason why we have a huge government deficit is because there's a lot of large companies like Airbnb and Facebook and other, they pay zero taxes. So they use offshore tax sheltering loopholes so that they actually don't contribute to, this question of how much and who gets taxed. The government, the legislative body is really terrible at designing good tax policies that actually tax these large companies and punish them for being overseas, partly because of the fact that those large companies provide campaign money and finance money to those very people that are supposed to be regulating them, right? So this is what's called regulatory capture, and that's a big, big reason why we have been running a deficit for the last 20 years. Literally, the last time we ran a surplus in the United States was 1997 with Bill Clinton. President Bill Clinton, who most of you probably don't know. Definitely don't remember, but don't know. He was the saxophone guy that got impeached. But anyways, so we'll pick up here in class. We'll talk about structural policy at the beginning of class on Friday. I hope you guys can make it.